Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our last event for the spring 2024 for the Research Data Portal Lunch and Learn series. And I'm going to put a link to the chat, put a link in the chat to the Research Data Portal. As I just said before the recording started, this is a portal linking together all Berkeley research data resources so that a researcher or research administrator has a single place, a single portal to find all things research data. We're hoping it's complete. If there's something you're aware of that ought to be there that isn't, please let us know. There's a place to email us. So we try to also put on lunch and learn webinars for people, for researchers and others. And today's discussion is on sharing your data outside of Berkeley. So, or maybe I guess from lab to lab, but sharing your data beyond where you are currently. And with that, let me welcome Terri Sale from the Office of Technology Licensing. And Terri, take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. Let's see there. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everybody, and thank you for registering and attending this presentation on sharing your data with third parties. Again, I am Terri Sale. I am at IPIRA's Office of Technology Licensing. And again, welcome. Wanted to cover some of the things that I hope you all can take away from this talk. So the objectives would be, one, how to work with IPIRA to share your data with an emphasis on outgoing data. Let me see if I can. Okay. The second major topic would be how to initiate a data transfer request. So I'll give you some information about where you can go to start the process, and probably spending more time on our review of that data transfer request, because there's some really key information that we need to know, and I'll provide some information on why we need to know it. I'll have a very quick slide on licensing data, because it's really not something that we do that often, and it comes with its own bag of caveats. And then at the end, I'll have a questions time. I won't be able to see any questions that come up in chat, and it's just easier if we just take all your questions at the end. So just want to also emphasize that this talk is about primarily outgoing data sharing. It's not about data management plans or how to include your data in a repository. I do invite you to either come back and ask me questions directly. My email address is at the beginning of the slide, and the slides will be available for you to take a look at later. We have a concierge button on our IPIRA website, and you can ask just about any question there. We'll make sure that the right person gets a response back to you. But if you do have questions about a data management plan, I do invite you to go to, again, that research data portal, or check in with the Berkeley Library Services for that. Sorry. So I think we're all here because we know how important data sharing is. And I just wanted to kind of cover in a few other points. It's a fundamental part of research. The data is the results, and it promotes our mission to expand public knowledge and promote open access to research data. And also many federal funding agencies have instituted requirements that apply to the institutions taking the funding, including Berkeley, and then requiring these data sharing or data management plans. So ultimately, our office's goal in facilitating the sharing of this data is to balance that mission with our obligations to protect private information and manage other potential restrictions from sharing that data. So Eric, when he came on, he's from the Industry Alliances Office. I'm from the Office of Technology Licensing. So throwing out lots of acronyms at you, I'm at OTL and he's at IAO. So we're both sister groups underneath IPIRA, and we both manage data sharing. The OTL, my group, manages requests for sending data out. That's what the talk is primarily going to be about. In the Industry Alliances group, they manage requests for incoming, or when you're receiving data from an outside party. And then on occasion, we're getting these requests now that involve both receiving or incoming, and then or sending or outgoing. And when it's both, and it's really something that we look at with regards to timing. If it's a situation where you're sending out data and 6 months or a year or longer later, they might be sending some data back. That's something we usually deal just one-off, right? I'll handle the outgoing, or if it's just coming in, IO will handle it. If it's one of these things where you're sending data out and fairly quickly they're going to be sending data back, that is managed also by the Industry Alliances group. So that's how you can work with or know who to go to when you get to the main page about if you're sending it out or if you're receiving it. And then how to initiate the process of data transfer. So again, on outgoing, we have our web page located here, and it'll be at the back. At the end of this presentation, there's going to be a resources page, and it'll be listed there as well. So this is where you go to find out. This will land you on a page that's going to provide you a list of documents, compliance documents, or other information that you may need to prepare in order to do a final submission. And you can always start the process and then save it and come back. But the page will just give you a list of things that we're going to be needing. If it's data from an IRB approved protocol, we'll want to get that ID number. We are now asking for a copy of any consents. It's just faster for us if you can provide that instead of us going to CPHS or and asking them, or going through the protocol and reviewing the consent separately. It's just faster turnaround if we can get that consent up front. We're going to need to know whether the data contains protected health information or other potentially sensitive information about people. Things like we will ask whether it's de-identified, and all 18 identifiers must be omitted in order for it to be de-identified. We've had some issues with that. I'll talk about CPHS pretty soon, but they have a really good website for information with regards to that. We'll also need to know if there's any pre-existing agreements that may either dictate ownership or other restrictions on the transfer. Seeing this sometimes in the way of awards, and if there was an award, maybe even a collaboration is going on and there was an agreement, many of them some of them address the kind of document or the kind of agreement that will need to be used in order to transfer the data. So we'll want to take a look at those agreements. So in reviewing the request to transfer the data, our office. So we have the questionnaire, all these questions. We're looking for answers to these questions, and they're kind of related to three main groups. We're trying to figure out what is it the researcher wants to do. And then we're trying to figure out, well, okay, I understand what you want to do, but can we do it? And the third is, well, how do we do it? How can we transfer that information? So those are the three main buckets that I want any sort of questions to answer. So in going and looking at that first bucket, what does the researcher want to do? And this is sometimes, if we're given enough information, we may even find that a data transfer agreement isn't necessary. Maybe it's not even data. maybe there's an underlying agreement that already sort of spelled out how it's going to be transferred. But we also need to find out what is the data, and I bring this up because we ask for, is this material or is this data? Someone clicked data one time, and then we asked for a description of the data, and they wrote data. So as you can imagine, that's not really enough information to provide in any data use agreement. Keeping in mind the other side is looking at this as, well, whatever this data is yours. So, you really have to sort of put some metes and bounds around what that data is. Is it research data obtained from patients from an IRB approved protocol? Again, we'll need to review the consents. We may need to check with CPHS to see if the consents allow for that further transfer and under what conditions and purposes. And continuing on, what is the data? Does it contain PHI as protected under HIPAA or FERPA? Does it contain health or other personal information? And is the data completely de-identified and not disclosed with the code or other means to re-identify? And again, I mentioned the CPHS's website. It's awesome for providing some additional information for researchers and trying to figure out whether they have PHI or personal information. It lists the 18 identifiers. So it's a really good resource to go to if you're not quite sure. And then prior to requesting transfer of data containing PHI or personal information not covered by HIPAA, you should, this is our advice, researchers should really consider whether such information is necessary. Oftentimes it's because it's there and it's easier to transfer, but if a little bit of time can be taken to remove the identifiers, it makes it much easier. There's less restrictions on the other side receiving the transfer. And it's just, if you don't have to provide that risky information, then don't provide it. It's just, that's preferable. And I like to mention that to people before you say that you must have it. And there may be some, maybe you can limit some of the information and we provide a limited data set. Or again, completely de-identifying. Just thinking about how effective the data can be without that information. And if it's still going to be effective, that's what we recommend. And then we're looking at who the recipient party is, some basic information. Are they a nonprofit or a for-profit? It may make a difference. A lot of times it doesn't, but it could make a difference as to whether they're a nonprofit or for-profit. We certainly need to take a look at that. I would say still 95% of what our requests are for nonprofit institutions in the US. But we will have to look at where is the recipient located? Are they outside the US? We may need to check with export control if the transfer is to a high-risk country. I think Brian's here from export control, and it's just another group that we are often consulting with. So even if it's to a country that's not a high-risk country, there could be some other concerns that we need to look into. If it's to an institution or a company in Europe, we'll have to consider the privacy laws. For example, the EU's GDPR, but there's other countries that have similar laws that we'd have to maybe check in with our privacy office on. So then this is the second bucket. Can we transfer? We've got enough information on what you want to do. Can we transfer the data? Well, I get the first issue that I'm looking at is, does UC own the data? We can only protect that which we own. So that's one of the things that we're checking on the questionnaire that we ask. And I brought up the more recent research data policy that UC has. It was effective as of a couple years ago. It's not a new policy. It just clarified a few buckets of data ownership. But essentially, the gem to take away on there is that we, the regents, retain ownership of research data created by or at the direction of university researchers or PIs during the course of university research. And comma, unless we've specifically otherwise agreed to. So sometimes in a sponsored research agreement or another agreement, we may have agreed to the ownership of the data being created to be owned by this other entity. So again, another reason why we need to be checking to see if there's any pre-existing or related agreements that we need to take a look at. So okay, and the other thing I have to look at is what kind of uses. So we can transfer it to a certain entity, but are there any restrictions on the use? And it must be consistent with the consents and any HIPAA or other privacy requirements. There could be, and I see this less in consents. Consents are fairly broad, but every now and then you'll see some restriction. It might be, the typical one is that it's for research uses only. But we'll, if there's a request for some commercial use, I'll have to check to see if that consent allows for that, or there's other concerns. The consents could be that we could share the data with only this institution that gathered the data, or a specific other institution. Or is it, if it doesn't mention anything, that we consider that broad, and that even commercial entities could use that for research purposes only. So anyway, we're just looking for any sort of restrictions in the consents or other agreements that would limit the purposes for which the third party that we're sharing the data can use that data for. And in those related agreements, there also could be confidentiality issues, ownership issues, sort of limited permissions for internal non-commercial research uses or publications. We just, again, all of these are the kinds of things that we're looking for, other terms and conditions that would be relevant in our creating a data use agreement. So we've looked at the first two buckets, and now we say, okay, we know what you want to do, we can do it, but how do we do it? So in our office, we use data use agreements for data sharing because they have the appropriate contract terms to facilitate the transfer and protect the interests of UC. And there's a number of, we have a couple templates that we use. We have been using the FDP data transfer use agreement more recently. We also have a new intercampus data use agreement that we've been using. So even when we're transferring data amongst the campuses, we'd like to get a data use agreement in place. It's actually very simple, the intercampus one, very similar to our intercampus MTA. It's a record. If there's any restrictions, though, we can point those out in the intercampus agreement. We use data use agreements for all transfers, whether the information is PHI, covered by HIPAA, FERPA, or not. If there's private information, or even personal information or other information, we can make some limitations. If it's basic data, we can make sure that there's nothing in the agreement that covers anything that's more restrictive. That's the good thing about the FDP, because there's an attachment and you just click the kind of data it is, and you know exactly the kinds of attachments that you need to include. And because all research data is owned by the regents, all outgoing data use agreements must be signed on behalf of the regents by the OTL. And if it's an incoming data use, it will be signed on behalf of the regents by the IAO. It cannot be signed by the researchers. So that's just my little plug, gets us into trouble. So, of course, one question that researchers always seem to want to know is, how long does it take to put a data use agreement in place? So it really is dependent on a number of factors, the complexity of the data transfer, There could be several different kinds of data involved. I'm going to be working on one that sounds like it's a little complex because there's a number of parties involved, and there's different kinds of, there's partially limited data sets, there's partially identifiable information. So again, that causes a level of complexity that could take a little longer. Also, if there's a lot of back and forth with the receiving party on the data use agreement, that can add some time. It's another reason why we started using the FDP data use agreement, because it is a type of general agreement that has been agreed to for use by a number of nonprofit institutions and including some federal agencies. And you can actually even make changes to it. You just have to get rid of the FDP logo on it. So it's been one, when we've used it, it seems to be very accepted by the recipient or receiving party. And then the other thing that could add to the time to get a data use agreement done is how many other campus offices are required. And again, I mentioned the IAO. So it's an incoming, outgoing, but no one's sure. So there's a little bit of information gathering at that stage to figure out what's the best way. If it's PHI information and consents, we may need to talk to CPHS about the IRB approval. We may need to contact the privacy office or export control. So if more of these offices are involved, longer it may take. It's just more people have to take a look at it. So for all of those reasons, I do recommend, or we recommend, that researchers initiate the process as early as possible, and maybe even pick up the phone if you think it's, you'll be reading the questionnaire, and if you can see that there's maybe some issues there, maybe it's best to pick up the phone and we'll have a conversation, and maybe we can get through some of this a little quicker. Then I mentioned to you that I would have this one slide on licensing data. We don't do it that much. We have licensed data before. It more often happens along with software. And as with know-how rights, our preference is to license that data non-exclusively. And for reasons: one, it allows for greater access to potentially many licensees, and that's one of the points of sharing data. But also because we found typically there's not a great deal of investment needed by a licensee when they get data licensed to them. They're selling the data or putting it in certain products or providing services. There's not a lot of R&D costs that they need, and in order to sort of create an exclusivity moat. I was like, I'm going to spend all this much money. I want some time to have exclusivity. We don't find that that's typically the case. But I will say it's not in black and white. It's not in stone. We have licensed exclusively, again, typically with a software situation. So it really depends. But I think, again, our preference is to try to license non-exclusively. And then if you're licensing data, it really does require even more examination of ownership, because there's a couple of factors. One, we're making warrants to the licensee that we own. So we want to make sure that that's the case. And data can be a little complicated, like copyrights. It can involve a lot of creators. We want to be able to, one, pay the creators when there's some net income from licensing, and we need to know who they are. So it can be difficult because in the situations with data also, sometimes that data was created over a very long period of time. So if you've had a lot of fingers in the pot, a lot of creators, it can be a little bit more difficult to sort of nail down who was the owner, or sorry, the creators, and make sure that we own it in order to license it. And I mentioned to you that I was going to have this resources page for you. I have checked the links. They did work. We've been making some changes to our website, so I just wanted to make sure that they all were functioning. Eric mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we have this research data portal. There's a lot of information that's there, including, as I mentioned, it gets repeated at the end. If there's, if there's a request or information is needed on how to get a data management plan or how to set up a data repository, I think there's some information there on the portal. If again, if you have some further questions or there's some information not there, just contact us. I've got email addresses, or you can contact IPIRA or hit our concierge button and ask questions. The data transfer requests, again, how you start the process, that's the second link. And the data policy that I mentioned, explaining how regions or what regions own is in that policy. And other brown bag videos are all also listed at that research data portal. So I think that covers the key resources. And so now I'm just going to, does anyone have any questions? Were there questions in the chat? Should I take a look?